Okay, so today is lecture number 16, and it's another one of our introductory lectures to a subdiscipline within anthropology. Specifically, today I'm going to talk really briefly about what cultural anthropology is and some of the kind of key concepts within cultural anthropology. So, just to kind of start off here, cultural anthropologists study the similarities and differences among living societies and cultural groups. So, that part about living cultural societies and groups is really one of the big differentiators between what sociocultural anthropologists do and what archaeologists do. So, through immersive fieldwork, living and working with the people one is studying, cultural anthropologists kind of suspend their own sense of what is normal in order to understand other people's perspectives. Beyond describing another way of life, cultural anthropologists ask broader questions about humankind. Are human emotions universal or culturally specific? Does globalization make us all the same, or do people maintain cultural differences? For cultural anthropologists, no aspect of human life is outside of their purview. They study art, religion, healing, natural disaster, and even pet cemeteries. Cultural anthropologists often study social groups that differ from their own, based on the view that kind of fresh insights are generated by an outsider trying to understand the insider point of view. And this is kind of linked to anthropology's origins as a kind of social science in which anthropologists are trying to maintain a kind of objective view of society. So, for example, in the 1960s, Jean Briggs immersed herself in the life of Inuit people in the central Canadian Arctic territory of Nunavut. She arrived knowing only a few words of their language, but ready to brave sub-zero temperatures to learn about this remote, rarely studied group of people. In her most famous book, Never in Anger, A Portrait of an Eskimo Family, which was published in 1970, Jean argued that anger and strong negative emotions are not expressed among families that live together in small igloos amid harsh environmental conditions for much of the year. In contrast to scholars who see anger as a kind of innate emotion, Briggs' research showed that all human emotions develop through culturally specific child-rearing practices that foster some emotions but not others. While cultural anthropologists traditionally conduct fieldwork in faraway places, they are increasingly turning their gaze inward to observe their own societies or subgroups within them. For instance, in the 1980s, American anthropologist Philippe Bourgeois sought to understand why pockets of extreme poverty persist amid the wealth and overall high quality of life here in the United States. To answer this question, he lived with Puerto Rican crack dealers in East Harlem, New York. Bourgeois contextualized the experience of these crack dealers both historically in terms of their Puerto Rican roots and migration to the U.S., and in the present as they experienced social marginalization and institutional racism. Rather than blame the crack dealers for their poor choices or blame our society for perpetuating inequality, he argued that both individual choices and social structures trap people in this kind of overlapping world of drugs and poverty. Cultural anthropologists study all aspects of culture, but what exactly is culture? Well, culture is a powerful defining characteristic of human groups that shapes our perceptions, our behaviors, and our relationships. One of the reasons that culture is kind of difficult to define is that it encompasses all of these kind of intangible qualities that make people who they are. Culture is basically the air we breathe. It sustains us and comprises us, yet we largely take it for granted. We are not always consciously aware of what our own culture is. Furthermore, cultural anthropologists themselves do not always agree on what culture is. In defining culture, some anthropologists emphasize material life and objects, for example, tools, clothing, and technologies. Others emphasize cultures as systems of intangible beliefs, and still others focus on practices or customs associated with daily life. So in this class, we will use a kind of broad definition of culture, which basically is a set of beliefs, practices, and symbols that are learned and shared. And together, these beliefs, practices, and symbols form an all-encompassing integrated system that binds people together and shapes their worldview in daily lives. To say that a group of people share a culture doesn't mean that all individuals think or act in identical ways, right? Just think about how different we are here in the United States, even though we share a lot of the same Western culture. One's beliefs and practices can vary within a culture depending on your age, gender, social status, and other characteristics. Yet members of a culture share many core things in common, specifically its beliefs and practices. So in this definition, a belief refers not just to what we believe to be right or wrong, true or false, but all of the mental aspects of culture, including our values, norms, philosophies, our worldviews, knowledge, and so on and so forth. Another key kind of uniting factor across differences within a culture are practices. So practices refer to behaviors and actions that may be motivated by belief or performed without reflection as part of everyday routines. Think about the fact that we brush our teeth every morning or every evening, right? This is a kind of habitual routine that we get into that isn't necessarily a deeply held belief, but is a part of our kind of cultural practice, our daily practice. So much like art and language, cultures are also symbolic. A symbol is something that stands for something else, often without a natural connection. Individuals create, interpret, and share the meanings of symbols within their own groups or the larger society. For example, in the US, everyone recognizes that little red octagonal sign as a stop sign, right? But in other places in Europe, it's often just a triangle and instead of an octagon. In other cases, groups in American society or elsewhere interpret the same symbol in different ways. So take the Confederate flag. Some people see the Confederate flag as a symbol of pride and a Southern heritage. Many others, however, see it as a symbol of the long legacy of slavery, segregation, and racial oppression in the American South and throughout the United States more broadly. Thus, displaying the Confederate flag could have positive or more often negative connotations. Cultural symbols are powerfully convey either shared or conflicting meanings across space and time. So in summary, we can think about culture as having the following characteristics. Humans are born with this kind of capacity to learn the culture of any social group. That means we're mentally fluid. We can adapt to any kind of cultural system in which we are what's called enculturated. And we learn culture both directly by our parents teaching us specific morals and habits, and also indirectly through observation. Culture changes in response to both internal and external factors, which means that cultures do not stay the same. This is a really important idea because it really pushes back against this idea of an authentic culture, which can be kind of isolated in time and place and understood to remain the same over time. Also, humans aren't bound by culture. They have the capacity to conform to it or not, and they also have the capacity to change it. Another key point here is that culture is symbolic. Individuals create and share the meanings of symbols within their group or society. The degree to which humans rely on culture really distinguishes us from other animals and has fundamentally shaped our evolution on different trajectories than other mammals. Finally, human culture and biology are intimately interrelated. Our biology, growth, and development are directly impacted by culture. So there's four kind of key perspectives that distinguish cultural anthropology from other disciplines like history, sociology, and psychology, which also study culture. These four differences revolve around holism, relativism, a comparative approach, and anthropological approaches to fieldwork. Okay, so holism, what is this? So one cannot fully appreciate what it means to be human by studying just one single aspect, one single sliver of our complex histories, languages, or societies. By using a holistic approach, cultural anthropologists ask how different aspects of human life influence one another. For example, a cultural anthropologist studying the meaning of marriage in a small village in India might consider local gender norms, existing family networks, laws regarding marriage, religious rules, and economic factors when trying to parse out how these kind of marriage behaviors work out on a day-to-day basis. The guiding philosophy of modern anthropology is cultural relativism. So in addition to taking this kind of holistic approach that looks at all facets of a society, cultural anthropologists are committed to cultural relativism, which is the idea that we should seek to understand another person's beliefs and behaviors from the perspective of their culture rather than our own. So anthropologists seek to understand people's beliefs within the system that they have for explaining things, rather than trying to explain them through our window. The opposite of cultural relativism is what's called ethnocentrism, which is the tendency to view one's own culture as the most important and correct, and as a measuring stick by which to evaluate all other cultures that are largely seen as inferior and morally suspect. As it turns out, many people are ethnocentric to some degree, and ethnocentrism is a common human experience that's often fueled by things like nationalism. So why do we respond the way we do? Why do we behave the way we do? Why do we believe what we believe? Most people find these kinds of questions difficult to answer. Often the answer is simply because that's how it's done. People typically believe that their ways of thinking and acting are normal, but at a more extreme level, some believe that their ways are better than others, and this is what leads to ethnocentrism. Another kind of core facet of the cultural anthropological approach that distinguishes it from other kind of human-centered disciplines is its comparative approach. So in cultural anthropology, we compare ideas, morals, practices, and systems within or between cultures. We might compare the roles of men and women in different societies, or contrast how different religious groups conflict within a given society. Like other disciplines that use comparative approaches, like sociology, cultural anthropologists make comparisons between people in a given society. Unlike these other disciplines, however, cultural anthropologists also compare across societies. The last big kind of difference around cultural anthropology is our kind of concepts of fieldwork. So in cultural anthropology, our fieldwork is referred to as ethnography, which is both the process and the result of cultural anthropological research. The term ethnography comes from the Greek word ethno, which refers to people, and graphy, which refers to writing. The word ethnography also refers to the kind of end results of our fieldwork. So cultural anthropologists don't really write novels, but they write what's called ethnographies, which are highly descriptive accounts of culture that weave in these detailed observations with larger theories about human societies. The ethnographic process involves the research methods of a participant observation. With participant observation, you basically do what it says. You participate in people's lives while observing them and taking field notes that, along with interviews and surveys, constitute the research data. This research is inductive, which means it's based on day-to-day observations that the anthropologist can use to kind of develop theories about the human condition more broadly. Oftentimes, informants actively participate in the research process, helping the cultural anthropologist ask better questions and understand different perspectives. To wrap up today, I just want to share a brief video about the research of one of our cultural anthropologists here at the University of Arizona, Eric Plemons. Eric is an associate professor in the School of Anthropology and specializes in medical anthropology, which is a subfield within cultural anthropology more broadly. And he does his research specifically on gender and sexuality here in the United States, which is why I want to feature his work in our kind of conversation for today. So I'll play this intro video and you can learn more about Eric's work.
I was the first person in my family to ever go to college, and I didn't really know what I was doing when I went to college, but I knew I wanted to be a writer somehow. I'd known that since I was very young. So when I went to college, I took a history course, and I was fascinated by history, so I ended up being a history major. I never took a social science course ever once. And then right after college, I transitioned, so I'm a trans man. And as part of that process for me, I started doing drop-in work with queer youth at a drop-in shelter in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from. And the experiences of those kids was completely different from my experience, and they were only 5 years younger than me. And the difference was that they came of age during the internet, and that was not really a big popular thing at the time when I was finishing college. It was just kind of emerging. And so I wanted to better understand how their world was different from mine, and I thought, well, I'll just go read about it. And so I went to Powell's bookstore, which is the best independent bookstore in the world, and there was nothing, or very little. And so I thought, well, if there aren't books, I'll write them. I'm a medical anthropologist, and what I say I do is I study the politics and practice of transgender medicine and mostly surgery. So when I say I study the politics, I mean the sort of contests for power that are always happening around transgender medicine. And so one of the questions I ask is, why are people continuing to fight so much about the questions of how people can change the sex and gender characteristics of their body? Who's in charge of making those decisions impact the people whose lives and bodies are changed by those interventions? So that's the politics part. And the practice part is, how do you actually go about changing sex and gender? As an anthropologist, that's an interesting question because we don't know what sex and gender are. They change depending on where you are, who you are, what time you live in, your class status, your racial status. All of these things are different. So when a surgeon goes into an operating room, they have to make a decision about those things. So if the question is, what is sex and gender, when you are the one in charge of building them, then that's a really interesting question. I wrote a book in 2017 called The Look of a Woman, Facial Feminization Surgery and the Aims of Trans Medicine, and it was awarded the Ruth Benedict Prize by the Association of Queer Anthropology as the best book of the year on a queer trans topic. Right now, I'm really interested in experimental and emerging medicine that's imagining the tissues taken from trans folks during their reconstructive surgeries as resources. The way I've imagined the project is called Architectures of Manhood. That's about different technologies to replace, repair, and rehabilitate male genitalia. Soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan right now are experiencing the highest rates of genital injury ever in the history of war. Because they're walking outside of their jeeps and stepping on bombs that explode up to the underside of their body and result in genital injury. And so the military is wondering what they can do about this. And one of the big initiatives has been to fund tissue engineering. And that's where trans bodies come in, because trans bodies end up being the source of the tissue scaffolds. So at the same time that you have trans folks being explicitly excluded from military service, you have the absolute utility of those bodies being needed to recuperate the American masculinity. My advice would be that I think a lot of young people imagine that whatever they major in has to be the name of a job. And that's really not true at all. And part of what you learn as a student in anthropology is to read critically, to think critically, to ask good questions, to consider an issue from multiple perspectives, and no matter what field you go into, that's valuable. To think very broadly about what you can do and what all of the skills that you learn in an anthropology program set you up to do well.
All right, that's all I have for you guys today. Make sure to tune in to the next lecture, lecture 17 on queering prehistory, where we'll kind of take up some of these ideas that Eric's talked about and apply them to the context of the prehistoric Paleolithic European past. All right, see you next time.